Minnie Pearl celebrated her 73rd birthday Friday.
Well, see, when I'd come in, they took it for granted that that I'd been around a great deal, which I had.
On a November night in 1940, inside the War Memorial Auditorium in Nashville, a 28-year-old woman stood in the wings, holding a straw hat she had bought that afternoon at a department store. She hadn't bothered to remove the price tag. In a few minutes, she would walk under the lights of the Grand Ole Opry, throw up one arm, and shout a single word that would follow her for the rest of her life: Howdee. The crowd erupted. Within days, sacks of fan mail began piling up at the radio station. A character had just been born, and almost nobody listening that night had any idea who was actually standing behind her. Her real name was Sarah Ophelia Colley, and she bore almost no resemblance to the gap-toothed, husband-hunting spinster from a place called Grinder's Switch that she had just handed to the American public. Sarah was cultured. She was educated. She had grown up wanting nothing to do with hillbilly comedy, and yet she would spend the next 5 decades of her life pretending to be exactly that, night after night, in front of audiences who never once glimpsed the woman underneath the hat. To understand how strange this arrangement really was, you have to start with the house she was born into. Sarah arrived on October 25, 1912, in Centerville, Tennessee, a modest county seat about 50 miles from Nashville. She was the last of 5 daughters, born to a mother already well into her 30s who assumed her childbearing years were behind her. Her father, Thomas Colley, ran a prosperous lumber and sawmill operation and was among the wealthiest men in the county. Her mother, Fanny, had been educated at a finishing school herself and played piano for the town's amateur theatrical productions. This was not a household that produced hillbilly comedians. It was a household that produced debutantes. Sarah was doted on constantly by her older sisters, treated almost like a living doll to be dressed and paraded around town, and she grew up soaking in the attention. She loved classical music. She loved poetry. When she watched country people from the surrounding hills come into Centerville, she watched them the way any well-off town child did, politely curious, but firmly on the outside looking in. As a girl, her parents took her to see a vaudeville show in Nashville, and a comedian playing a broad rural character brought the house down. Sarah had no way of knowing it then, but she had just watched a rough outline of her own future cross a stage in front of her, even though every instinct in her at the time pointed somewhere else entirely, toward Broadway, toward serious dramatic acting, toward anything but comedy. When she finished high school around 1930, her family scraped together tuition, even after taking real losses in the Depression, to send her to Ward Belmont College in Nashville, then considered the premier finishing school for young women in the South. She studied what the school called expression, drama, dance, elocution, stagecraft, with every intention of becoming a legitimate actress. There was just one problem. Whenever she tried to play something serious, audiences laughed anyway. It infuriated her at the time. She had a gift for comedy that she hadn't asked for and didn't want, and she spent years trying to talk herself out of it. After graduating in 1932, custom required that she wait until she turned 21 before striking out on her own, so she spent 2 restless years back in Centerville teaching dance, drama, and piano to local children, certain that a bigger stage was waiting for her somewhere. In 1934, it finally arrived, though not in the form she expected. She took a job with a small traveling theatrical company out of Atlanta, work that involved driving from one small southern town to the next, coaching local farmers, shopkeepers, and church groups through amateur productions. Her family was mortified. For a Colley daughter to go into show business at all bordered on scandalous, and this was the lowest rung of show business imaginable, boarding in strangers' spare rooms, moving on every few weeks, living out of a single suitcase. For 6 years she crisscrossed Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas this way, and something unexpected happened to her along the road. She began to genuinely love the people she was staying with. She sat at their kitchen tables, listened to how they talked, absorbed their timing, their turns of phrase, their particular brand of humor. The girl who had once viewed country folks as curiosities slowly stopped seeing them that way altogether. Around 1936, while staying with a family on Sand Mountain in northern Alabama, she met an older woman in her 70s with an easy laugh and an endless supply of stories, someone she found utterly delightful. Pieces of that woman, along with pieces of dozens of other people she'd met along her circuit, began fusing together in Sarah's imagination into a single character. That character was never meant to mock anyone. She was built, quite literally, out of affection. She tried the character out publicly for the first time in 1939 at a women's club event in Aiken, South Carolina. Needing a costume in a hurry, she bought a cheap straw hat at a downtown store and, either by accident or simple haste, never removed the cardboard price tag. Midway through a routine, the tag swung into view and the room roared with laughter. It hadn't been planned, but Sarah recognized a good accident when she saw one, and that tag never came off again. She began performing under the name Minnie Pearl, and the character caught on so quickly that the drama coach who invented her began to disappear behind it. In 1940, she performed the routine at a bankers' convention back in Centerville, where two executives from WSM Radio happened to be in the audience. They offered her a slot on the Grand Ole Opry, though not without hesitation. They worried a rural audience might resent a woman appearing to poke fun at country people, so they buried her in a cautious 3-minute slot near the end of the broadcast. The fan mail that followed answered the question for them almost immediately. Listeners didn't feel mocked. They felt like they'd just met a new friend. Within a short time, Roy Acuff himself, already the biggest name in country music, invited her to join his traveling show, launching a partnership and friendship that would help anchor the Opry for the next half-century. What almost nobody realized was how much careful engineering went into something that looked so effortlessly silly. Sarah treated the character with total seriousness, working over line readings for hours, refining the timing of every pause the way her Ward Belmont instructors had once taught her to time a dramatic monologue. Every detail was a decision. The dress had to look homemade without looking shabby, the paper flowers on the hat cheerful without tipping into absurd, the voice broad without ever curdling into contempt. And she held to one rule for 50 straight years without exception. Minnie Pearl was never the butt of the joke aimed at country people themselves. Audiences laughed with her, at her own vanity and her endless bad luck with men, never at the community she represented. Sarah had eaten at too many of those families' tables to ever trade their dignity for punchline. In 1947, she married Henry Cannon, a former military pilot who ran a charter flight service ferrying country stars to their shows, including Hank Williams and later Elvis Presley. Henry became not just her husband but her manager and personal pilot, flying her to one-night stands across the country all week long, and always delivering her back to Nashville in time for Saturday's Opry broadcast. Even he mostly just called her Minnie. It was, by every account, a genuinely happy marriage that lasted nearly 50 years. And here is where her arrangement became something more unusual than simple stage name branding. Offstage, Sarah Cannon lived as a pillar of Nashville high society, an accomplished tennis player at the country club, a devoted member of Brentwood Methodist Church, a gracious hostess whose home on Curtiswood Lane sat directly beside the Tennessee governor's mansion. Unstage, she was still the husband-hunting hayseed from Grinder Switch, a name she'd borrowed from a real railroad switching stop near her father's old sawmill. Nashville in those decades was quietly divided between its old money elite, who liked to call their city the Athens of the South, and the newer country music industry the old god privately dismissed as hillbilly heaven. Most people picked a side. Sarah Cannon somehow belonged fully to both, welcomed in the drawing rooms of the elite and worshipped from the cheap seats of the Opry, without ever once looking down on either world. Through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, she became something close to a permanent fixture of American entertainment. She scored an unlikely country hit record in 1966. In 1969, a new television show called Hee-Haw introduced her, hat and price tag intact, to an entirely fresh generation who had never heard her on the radio. In 1975, she was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the first woman ever admitted primarily as a comedian, standing alongside the singers and songwriters she had shared stages with for decades. That same year, the National Conference of Christians and Jews honored her with its Brotherhood Award, a recognition not of her comic timing but of her character. Then in 1985, at the height of that long, comfortable fame, Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent a double mastectomy and radiation, and true to form, she did it almost entirely out of public view. The character's entire job, week after week, was to walk out and declare how proud she was to be there. And somehow she kept doing that job through the most frightening stretch of her own life without letting the audience see a flicker of what she was carrying. Rather than retreat into privacy once she recovered, she turned the experience outward, becoming a public advocate for early cancer screening and lending her real name, for the first time in decades, to a cause. The Nashville hospital that treated her later renamed its cancer program in her honor. It is called the Sarah Cannon Cancer Center today, and it has since grown into a network spanning several states. It's fair to say that a good number of women are alive today because a comedian used her own diagnosis to tell them not to wait. She kept performing until a stroke in June of 1991 ended her career for good. She never appeared on stage again. The following year, her old friend and longtime Opry partner Roy Acuff passed away, and Sarah spent her remaining years out of the public eye, her health declining quietly. She died on March 4, 1996, at 83 years old, of complications from that stroke, and was buried under her real name at Mount Hope Cemetery in Franklin, Tennessee. Henry followed her the next year. What's striking, looking back at the whole of it, is how little scandal there ever was to uncover. No feuds, no hidden cruelty, no gap between the beloved public figure and the private woman behind her. The secret Sarah Cannon carried for 50 years wasn't a dark one at all. It was simply that the country spinster millions adored had been invented and lovingly maintained by a refined, classically trained woman who used the disguise for nothing but kindness. She once said the dangling price tag on that hat felt symbolic of ordinary human frailty, of everyone walking around a little too proud of themselves to notice what's still hanging off their own bring. A bronze statue of her stands today in the lobby of the Ryman Auditorium, hat and tag included, greeting every crowd that files in for a show. And somewhere, every time the Opry lights come up, that same holler still seems to echo through the room. Howdee. I'm just so proud to be here. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.